Most people treat brokenness like a technical failure, a gap in the resume, a silent house, a heart that stopped working. You've been trying to fix the pieces so you can finally return to God. But what if the crack wasn't the problem? What if the crack was the door? The architecture of the crack. Brokenness rarely looks like a dramatic explosion. For most of us, it looks like a Tuesday that stayed gray. It's the grief of a chair that's now empty, or the heavy, iron weight of a failure you can't outrun. You feel like a broken vessel, and in your mind, a broken vessel is a useless one. You've spent months, maybe years, trying to glue the pieces back together before you dare to show up in the room where decisions get made. You think God is waiting for the restored version of you. But here is the architecture of grace. God does not do his best work with the whole. In the economy of the kingdom, the broken version of you is the only one that is actually permeable. The whole version of you was a closed system. It was a container that only had room for its own strength. But the crack? The crack is where the oxygen gets in. It is the first time in your life that you are actually open. But being open is terrifying, which is why most of us immediately try to perform our way out of the pain. The performance trap. When we feel broken, our instinct is to become Martha. We think if we can just be more disciplined, more consistent, and more religious, we can compensate for the hole in our souls. We start reading the chapters and saying the prayers, not because we want the person, but because we want to prove we aren't as damaged as we feel. We've made the spiritual disciplines the relationship itself. The performance trap is the most sophisticated way to avoid God. It feels like faithfulness, but it's actually a shield. You're doing the right things for the right person, but you haven't stopped moving long enough to be in the room with him. You're treating your spiritual life like a job you're afraid of losing. You think your usefulness to God is tied to your wholeness. It isn't. If you stop the performance, you'll find yourself at a wall, the place where the list finally runs out. The silence of the second level. Eventually, the resource prayer stops working. You've brought the list of requests, fix the grief, restore the loss, make the failure go away, and God is silent. This is the moment most people walk away because they've decided what God is for, and if he isn't a cosmic vending machine for healing, they don't know how to relate to him. This silence isn't a rejection, it's a relocation. God is moving you from level 2 to level 3. He is inviting you to want the provider more than the provision. When the requests aren't answered, it forces you to look at the person standing in the room with you. The silence is the only thing loud enough to break your addiction to results. But to stay in that room, you have to pay a cost that your ego has been negotiating against for years. The cost of the climb. Intimacy with God isn't about adding more to your life. It's about what you're willing to release. For the broken person, the hardest thing to release is the control of the recovery process. You want to know the timeline. You want to know when the grief ends. You want a resurrection theology without the 3 days in the tomb. Trust is the first level that reaches into your hands and asks you to open them. It is Genesis 22, the moment you climb the mountain with the very thing you love most. Not because it makes sense, but because the relationship is solid enough to hold the weight of the mystery. You move anyway. Not because you feel brave, but because you finally realized your careful planning never actually kept you safe. When you finally open your hands, you're forced to show God what was hiding inside them all along. The beautiful mess. Level 5 is vulnerability, and it's the level the serious Christian fears most. It's bringing God your actual interior life, the anger that you still feel toward him, the doubt that your prayers are hitting the ceiling, and the sheer exhaustion of trying to be okay. Most of us approach God composed, but you cannot get close to someone you are performing for. David was a man after God's own heart, because he talked to God with a raw, unfiltered honesty that would make most modern churches uncomfortable. He poured out his heart, and pouring is messy. When you finally stop holding it together, you realize that God wasn't waiting for your theological conclusions. He was waiting for you. The mess isn't the obstacle, it's the invitation. Once you bring the mess to the altar starts to show up in the most ordinary places. The kitchen sink prophet. There is no sacred and secular. There is only the presence and our awareness of it. Like Brother Lawrence in the monastery kitchen, you start to realize that God is just as present in the laundry and the spreadsheets as he is in the cathedral. For the broken person, this is the beginning of healing. Healing isn't a destination you reach, it's a context you live in. You stop visiting God on Sundays and start living with him on Mondays. The grief doesn't necessarily disappear, but it becomes a room you share with a friend. The awareness of his presence stops requiring effort. It becomes the undercurrent, the background music of your entire ordinary life. But even this communion has a final hurdle, the hardest thing you will ever have to give up: the death of the seeker. Level 7 is union. It's the level almost nobody reaches because it requires the death of the spiritual self. It requires you to stop being the one who is seeking God and start being the one who is found by Him. For someone who has built an identity around being a disciplined believer or a struggling survivor, putting that down feels like death. It is the Galatians 2 verse 20 reality. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. You stop trying to use God to fix your brokenness, and you realize that your brokenness was just the displacement of you so that He could finally move in. You aren't the main character anymore. The striving has finally, mercifully, ceased. When the striving stops, the fruit finally begins to grow. The rest that produces. We were handed a version of Christianity that made doing the goal. But the branch doesn't work to produce grapes. It simply remains in the vine. Rest is not laziness. It is the ultimate form of spiritual surrender. When you are broken, you think you need to work harder to make up for your deficiency. But level 7 is the realization that, apart from Him, you can do nothing. The fruit of your life, the peace, the joy, the resilience is the overflow of your remaining, not the result of your striving. You aren't recovering from your loss anymore. You are being filled by a person. You've moved from the floor of salvation to the ceiling of union. And that leads us to the only question that matters for you right now: the invitation. God isn't on the other side of a distance you are responsible for closing. He is in the room. He was in the failure. He was in the grief. And He is in this very moment. The word for you right now isn't a command to do more. It's an invitation to stop. Stop the climb. Stop the negotiation. Stop the performance. Take a second, right where you are, and breathe. You don't have to be whole to be His. You just have to be here. If you're ready to stop the climb and start the union, join me in a simple moment of surrender. Let's talk to Him, not as a resource, but as the atmosphere we live in.